This episode is brought to you by the IoT Impact Conference. Whichever industry you work in, the Internet of Things is a game changer. The only event that gives you access to Internet of Things experts and users in a range of Australian industries is the IoT Impact Conference in Melbourne on June 9. Book your ticket now at www.iothub.com.au/IoT-impact.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the iTnews podcast. Our guest this week is ANZ's Group Executive Technology, Gerard Florian. A lot of listeners and readers of iTnews are going to be fairly familiar with some of Gerard's work, and we've tried to get as much of it as possible into this podcast. So you'll hear Gerard talk about the structure of the technology organisation, about key strategic pillars, and about elevating the technology function of a Big Four bank. We also dive into specifics on their ongoing cloud journey, on the embrace of FinOps, and the halo effect of ANZ Plus. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did having it.
I guess just to start with, it'd be useful just to get a bit of a sense of ANZ's technology organisation and just to talk a little bit about its makeup, its size and its structure at the moment.
Well, when we think about the ANZ Technology Organisation, probably the first thing to call out is that it's a single organisation covering a business that is global in nature. So we don't have lots of different tech organisations, it is one. And it covers effectively three major banking businesses, our retail and commercial bank in Australia, the same in New Zealand, and then our institutional business, which of course is international, covering 34 countries around the world. The model for that team is certainly one that we've been working on for a while now. We've made some fairly public statements early on in my time here at the bank as we looked at how we work and moving to a more agile way of working. A key part of that is building teams that work very closely with the business. So we try, in many cases, to actually have teams where it's not clear who's business and who's tech. They're all one group working on common projects. But even where it's not quite as blended as that, there's still a very close working relationship. So I effectively have a number of divisional CIOs who manage the business sections that I just spoke about. And then, of course, we've got the division of the central functions like finance, talent and culture, where there's also a divisional CIO responsible for that. And then we think centrally about things like our infrastructure, cloud, security. Those groups also report into me, but are run by separate leaders providing services to the whole of the bank.
Can you talk a little bit about that division of labour, I guess, and what you consider a central kind of technology versus what would have a divisional CIO, for example, and would be operated more from a business standpoint?
Certainly can. So the things that are central are more of the traditional infrastructure platforms. So if you think about things like compute, networking and security, we think about storage, some of our data assets that are used across the entire bank, they sit within those more central teams. Whereas the tech team that's working in our institutional bank focuses very much on things like our markets business in institutional, or our international payments business, or our trade lifecycle business in institutional. The New Zealand retail team is focusing on things like deposits and home loans in New Zealand, and similarly the Australia retail team is focusing on things like cards and mortgages in Australia. And of course, we've got ANZ Plus that we might come back to a little bit later, focusing on some of that work. So those groups are focusing very much on applications that our bankers will use, whereas customers may interface directly with in the form of a mobile application, whereas the central teams are providing a lot of the underlying componentry that then supports those applications.
And do you want to talk a little bit about the interplay or the division of responsibility between yourself and the relatively recent appointment of a CTO?
There's a couple of thoughts here, if I can, just to try and quickly get them out there. One is, firstly, what's the main job to be done? The main job to be done by a CTO, in my view, is to look around the corner, see what's coming, and then use that vision to help us with our strategy, our plans, as well as some of the day-to-day execution that we need to do. Now, historically, we had a few people, including myself, doing parts of that. But by having Tim Hogarth in the role of CTO, it's sort of more formalised that responsibility. And that can look at anything from spending time with the research analysts, spending time with some of our strategic vendor partners, talking to customers, but really just trying to get an idea, sort of outside in, of what's coming, what are some of those trends that we need to make sure we're getting ready for. However, the challenge can be, and the CTO function in different organisations, the pendulum will swing, reporting lines and all sorts of things. Tim reports to me, so he's part of the technology organisation. The risk is you don't want to become too theoretical. You do want it to be grounded in ideas that we can actually do something with. And so what I've done there is I've asked Tim to also take responsibility for our architecture and engineering. I'm going to call it a guild. What I mean by that is it's the community of engineers and architects. They don't necessarily report into Tim. They report into different line managers. But there's a very, very soft dotted line, if you like, up into Tim. What that means is that he is setting the architectural direction which is critical. I'll come back to that a bit later, maybe when we talk about our overall strategy. But he's also very closely connected to the engineering community, who, of course, are going to build the things that actually make up our future state environment. So by having one person looking around the corner, thinking about what's coming, thinking about our architecture, and thinking about the builders, the people who are going to then create the apps and the environment we need, I think you've got a very powerful combination. And then, of course, Tim is working closely with me and the rest of the team to say, how do we turn all that into a strategic plan and execute against it?
And are you able to talk a little bit about ANZ's technology strategy and some of the sort of key pillars that you're focused on?
Certainly. When I think about where we are at as a bank, firstly, it's important for any organisation to make sure the tech strategy is lined up with the business. And you'll have seen Shane Elliott, our CEO, talk about 4 major areas of focus, that the propositions that our customers love, building of platforms that give us opportunities, I guess, to scale more broadly, thinking about partnerships in a digital world, how do we work with other organisations closely? And then, of course, we've already started to talk about people, but the importance of our people and our purpose. That's our business strategy. What's critical is the tech strategy's got to align with that. The starting point for technology is that we need to be both an enabler and a driver. I think we've got a bigger seat at the table in any organisation post-COVID. People recognise the importance of technology, and we've got to have a strong opinion. We need that vision that we spoke about earlier on in order to drive what is happening. And our approach, or the direction that we've laid down as far as the major objectives, a big part of it is supporting this adaptive, nimble business that Shane and the board have set as the direction for ANZ. What that means technically is perhaps less of the more traditional monolithic stacks and more of an understanding of key components, thinking about how you might use areas such as cloud, thinking about things like integration and looking at the way in which you build the points of integration between those components, and thinking about things, of course, like the tooling that bankers and customers will need, as well as data, both operational and customer data. But each of those areas quite thoughtfully, so that as we make many investments throughout the year and throughout multiple years, we are continuously evolving our environment. We don't have a big bang project. It's not a one-off thing to go and build. It's about building an adaptive tech stack that will support the business that is also trying to be more adaptive.
I wanted to ask about a couple of things that I saw you speak about over the last 12 months. One of them was that I saw a snippet of a presentation where you talked about elevating technology from being tech-focused to customer-focused. And I was interested in just understanding a little bit more about that, but also about how else ANZ's technology function has really changed over the 5 years that you've led it.
So I think we have been able, and part of this is the role that the leadership team have played. Part of it's something as simple, and you'll hear a lot about this in different areas around the proverbial seat at the table, but it was a decision of Shane, not mine, to think about reporting structures. And by having, I guess, me as part of Shane's team, and therefore my team more directly involved in the conversations within the business, that in itself is a change. It means that you get a better sense of what's going on, what's needed, what are the issues that we have to focus on. And so that, if you think about some of the changes, one of them is simply the way in which the business sees the relevance of technology. I'll say internally, people weren't necessarily as happy as they would like to have been with perhaps some of their experiences with tooling. There's always the usual issues that any tech shop has to deal with. But how do we get in front of those issues, but also talk to the business and explain to them the value of the work we're doing so they better understand it? That's been a part of our journey over the last little while. So I like to think that tech today is a well-respected part of the ANZ organisation, but probably more importantly now, as we really look to literally get off our heels and onto our toes, we see that the work that's sitting in front of us is going to make a material difference for our customers. And those customers, whether they're retail customers or business customers, whether it's through applications like ANZ Plus, or it's movement into new payment services, or it's things that may help inform some of our institutional customers of changes in their market and they need real-time market information to make the decisions they do. Technology is a part of it. I keep saying that we're not becoming a tech shop. We are absolutely a bank. But just as software has eaten movies, if you're in the movie business, software is eating your car. Every time we get a download for our car, we're reminded of tech. Software is also eating money. And as software eats money, tech becomes more important in a bank.
How do you actually change that perception? Is it the material difference? Is it demonstrating that material difference in all the different aspects of the business and the role that technology can play? Or is there other aspects to really changing that perception internally?
I think that comes back to your first point about customer. The biggest shift, I believe, starts with actually understanding your customer. And it can be the internal customer, the banker, for example, or it might be the external customer, but understanding their needs, understanding what really matters, and then going away and being quite thoughtful about how can technology make a difference. If I just use a simple thing like rolling out Teams during COVID, it would be quite easy just to roll it out, turn it on and say job done. But when you start to spend time with our customers, our staff, and get a better idea of some of the challenges they're facing, some of the things they needed to learn, we started to run a whole range of education programs because you didn't have the luxury of the usual training plans. And we did that through our internal intranet, our Yammer service, and tried to be quite creative about the way in which we engage people and got them through that early period so that they stuck with it. And now we have a very high adoption rate across teams. So that's thinking about your customer, understanding your customer, and then really using the technology to solve problems.
And was that a challenging thing to do with the technology organisation? What was involved in actually seeding this on the technology side of the business?
I wouldn't say it was a challenge. I would say it was something different. And I guess this all just comes down to different people's background and perspective. I happen, previously to the bank, to have had time in product management. I've even had a role as a chief marketing officer. And part of the reason I actually took on that marketing role because I love telling stories about what technology can do. So it happened to be for a tech company. But part of that background probably influences my desire to be always looking for stories to tell, always looking for ways to influence, whether it's the board's understanding of what we're doing. Take something as simple as cloud. Nobody goes to cloud because they particularly want to be in the cloud. The purpose of getting to the cloud is because there's something on the other side of that that could be about data, it could be about a new application. So how do you bring that to life for a stakeholder, for a regulator, for the rest of the staff, so they all have confidence in what we're doing? That storytelling is part of what we need to do as a technology organisation. So that has been a little bit of a different way of thinking, not a challenge, there's no resistance, but people have had to just think a little differently and got the whole of the division now thinking about stories that they can tell.
You've just mentioned cloud there, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about where you're at in your cloud journey and the different clouds and different options that fit into the mix for ANZ.
Certainly. So this would be an area where, for a range of reasons, we were probably a little slower out of the blocks, certainly at scale, while we've been using cloud for many years, maybe not quite at the scale we would like. And over the last couple of years, we've brought some people into the organisation who have had experience doing this with other financial services companies. We've also been working with our cloud partners, as you'd expect. The result of that is that we've got a pretty clear plan now and are well into that plan as far as migrating our estate. And clearly the estate is a combination of production applications, non-prod, testing environments, etc. And we would expect that over the next, I'll call it 3 to 5 years, we will have the majority of our estate in the cloud. Now, there'll be some components that won't move to the cloud for a range of reasons. Some of them may be regulatory, some of them may be performance or actually age of system or even type of system. What we will do there, though, is still make our environment inside our data center as cloud-like as possible. So we certainly believe in the fundamental principles around cloud as far as automation, elasticity, availability, resilience. We want to use the hyperscalers as much as possible. We have a hybrid strategy there to use 2 providers. And we will have a cloud-like environment with our own data center for those applications that we choose not to move.
And on the cloud side of things, how much of that is being recently driven out of the work that went in the background of the ANZ Plus effort?
It's been quite interesting, actually. ANZ Plus has been a very helpful catalyst for what we were doing in cloud. It's not by any means the only area. So I mentioned earlier things like payments, a lot of the work we're doing in New Zealand at the moment, and some of our back office areas, for example, in our talent and culture area. These are all places where we are midway through various cloud migrations or building new solutions. ANZ Plus gave us an opportunity to think differently about how do we combine a number of technologies or components using the cloud as an underpinning foundation, but also working not only with new infrastructure, but also new application providers, specialist companies in the financial services area such as Zafin, but also well-known organisations such as Salesforce who have a lot of experience providing their solutions in the cloud. Putting all those components together, ANZ Plus enabled us to effectively build some key components of our stack, starting with the customer and working back. It's not a bank. It is actually plugged into some traditional parts of our existing bank. So in and of itself, it's only part of the solution. But given the complexity of that environment and also given the amount of the componentry there that's cloud-based, we've learned a lot which we can apply elsewhere in the organisation.
Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about finance and the influence of finance on IT. And it's something that is not just seen in ANZ, for example, it's seen across all the banks and it's seen across a lot of larger organisations now as well, with practices like FinOps and also with TBM, which ANZ is obviously a part of or is implementing. One of the things that you've mentioned before is around this idea of iterative funding models for technology and digital projects. And it's a model that we see, for example, with the New South Wales government as well, in terms of their digital fund. I'm really interested in just to explore this a little bit more and just to try and understand a little bit about the standards that are set and some of the gates that technology teams have to pass from a benefit standpoint to basically get to that next rung of funding.
There's a fair bit in that question, so I'll try not to talk too long, but interrupt me if I get caught. So let me start with the fundamental piece of my thinking here, the relationship between finance and technology. What is critical is that finance and tech have a very close working relationship, and what is often missing is a common fact base, a set of numbers that both parties look at and say, yep, they're the numbers. What can happen is finance may turn up with a more traditional general ledger view with all of the usual categories within the ledger. I've got power, I've got people, I've got compute and storage and software. And tech turns up with, well, these are my applications. And you can't actually combine the two, you can't compare the two, you can't have a sensible conversation. So we've put a lot of work to build our management accounts, and this is where TBM fits, to help have a common set of data where we all understand the cost to operate part of the estate. It might be institutional, it might be payroll, whatever it might be. With that information, you can then start to have discussions around, well, where do we need to make investments? That may be because of age of asset. It may be because of cost to operate is too high. Or it may be looking at a brand new investment and you just need to be able to understand where does that fit in the grand scheme of things. So I think finance and tech working together more closely, particularly as tech becomes more than an insignificant line item. As I said earlier, software is eating the world. So as tech continues to, consume the budget of any organisation, being really clear from the financial management side as to the priorities and so on is vital. To your question on benefits, just briefly, that again is another important discussion to make sure that we're all clear on, are we talking about hard benefits or soft benefits? Do we agree that cost avoidance is a thing or not a thing? And there's a lot of different debates around that. And understandably, finance is always quite skeptical about some of the promises because they don't necessarily come to fruition. So working with finance, I'm quite pleased with the relationship we have with our finance department today. It means that we can actually help with the strategic investment planning for the bank, not just from a tech point of view, but more broadly from the bank, because we are coming to the table to help that whole process of trying to make sure that you're allocating your capital to the areas that matter most.
And I guess the question I had kind of balancing that though is how do you make sure that experimentation is still allowed to happen when there's a real kind of focus and drive on making sure that something is proved before it can get more funding? How do you still make sure that the different parts of the bank are able to take those risks, even if they don't necessarily work out?
It comes back to the part I didn't answer before on the iterative piece. So firstly, we take a portfolio view, which sort of says, well, a percentage of our portfolio should be looking at more compliance work that we need to do, obviously, as a regulated entity. How do we make sure that we're spending enough on maintenance and operating what we have? And how do we also make sure that we've got enough of the portfolio looking at some of those new things? Otherwise, Tim and the team who are looking around the corner are wasting their time, right? So we want to make sure that we've got a balance there. But the iterative piece is important because I think one of the big shifts for all organisations is the days of the big 3-year, 5-year massive project that's completely defined up front and all of the funds are committed up front with a 5-year plan. Those projects now in tech are becoming less and less common. You might need it if you're building battleships or major highways and tunnels, but too much changes in technology to have that committed position 5 or 10 years in advance. So what you need is a good idea of where you're heading. You need, back to our earlier point around that modular approach, and then the iterative funding simply says, well, so long as you can show that you're continuing to deliver value along the way, then you should keep getting your money. And so that puts pressure back on the technology organisation to keep delivering small bits of value. ANZ Plus is a perfect example where we've gone to market with a minimum viable product and then we will rapidly release more features, and that lends itself to a more iterative approach. That means that the likelihood of success, I believe, is far higher, and the risk that used to be associated with some of those multi-year mega projects to some degree goes away.
And are there things that were developed as part of ANZ Plus that are cross-applicable or reusable in other parts of the bank?
Very much so, right? I kind of think about a halo effect of Plus is at 2 levels. There is componentry and there are procedures and ideas that will be reusable elsewhere. but there are also people who've learnt skills. Some of those people will end up working on areas outside of Plus. So as an organisation, we will benefit significantly from the innovation that's taking place there, as we do from innovation that's taking place in other parts of the bank.
One final question. Just wondering what excites you about the next 12 months at ANZ, or specifically within technology or more broadly?
I'm very excited about the fact that those two pieces come together for me. As I mentioned earlier, the position or the respect that technology has within ANZ is at a level today that we can have a real impact on the business. And at the same time, I believe that our business is very aware of a more digital future and the benefit that tech can provide. So there's mutual desire to be working very closely together. And I think that's really, really exciting. And it creates opportunities where you're not at loggerheads, you're not fighting, you're not arguing. You really are leaning in to provide, as we say, propositions that our customers will love. And that excites me.
That was Gerard Florian from ANZ Banking Group. And that's the podcast for this week. We'll be back with an exciting new interview next week. Until then, you can catch all the latest headlines in Australian IT over at itnews.com.au.